1902 photograph captured a reflection that should not have been possible. Dr. Evelyn Carter had given her career to preserving African American history in the post-Reconstruction South. As the lead archivist at the Charleston Historical Society, she had examined countless photographs that carefully built the myth of Southern prosperity and progress. Nothing prepared her for the discovery she made on a humid afternoon in June 2019. The photograph arrived with an estate donation from the Whitmore family, longtime Charleston Society members dating back to the antebellum years. Most of the collection was ordinary: formal portraits, garden parties, christenings. One image stopped her mid-cataloging. It was simply labeled, "Reception at Whitmore House, April 1902. About 15 white guests stood in an opulent parlor, men in dark suits, women in high-collared dresses and ornate hats. Behind them hung an enormous gilt-framed mirror that reflected the chandelier-lit room. Carter first set it aside as unremarkable. Something kept nagging at her. She returned with a magnifying glass and looked again. In the mirror's reflection, where one of the white guests should have appeared, stood a completely different figure. An elderly black woman in a plain dark dress, occupying the exact position of a white man in the main image. Carter's heart raced. Photographic reflections must match the scene being photographed. Yet here was a clear discrepancy. She scanned the photograph at high resolution and zoomed in on the computer. Both the main scene and the reflection were perfectly sharp. The woman's posture was rigid and formal, but her face showed deep pain. The scars on her cheeks and forehead were unmistakable, whip scars, permanent marks of brutal punishment. Double exposure was a common error of the era, yet the clarity of both images argued against a simple accident. Carter began methodical investigation. Whitmore family records showed the reception celebrated the opening of a new wing of the house. The guest list mentioned no black attendees. The next morning she visited the Whitmore mansion, now a museum. The parlor was easy to find. The distinctive mirror still hung in the same place. Standing where the photographer must have stood in 1902, she compared a copy of the photograph to the present room. Every architectural detail matched. Back at the archives, she turned to antebellum property records. Colonel Richard Whitmore had built the mansion in 1847. He owned 3 rice plantations in the Low Country and listed 247 enslaved people, plus 12 house servants at the Charleston residence. Estate inventories reduced human beings to line items: first name only, age, approximate value, sometimes a brief note of skills. One 1853 entry read, "Sarah, female, age 8, house servant, skilled in sewing and childcare, value $400. If this Sarah had survived and remained with the family, she would have been about 57 in 1902, the approximate age of the woman in the mirror. Household account books from the 1850s and early 1860s contained scattered mentions: cloth for Sarah's dress, Sarah attending Mrs. Whitmore during illness, and a March 1859 entry in the Colonel's own hand: Sarah punished for insolence, 20 lashes administered, will not tolerate disrespect from servants. Carter closed her eyes. An 11-year-old girl whipped for insolence. The scars on the woman in the photograph suddenly made terrible sense. They were the accumulated evidence of years of brutality that began in childhood. After the Civil War ended in 1865, legal status changed, but actual conditions often remained exploitative. A labor contract dated January 1866 bound Sarah, no surname, to continue as a house servant for room, board, and $2 a month. A clause forbade her from leaving the household without permission. She signed with an X, as did many others who had never been taught to read or write. Similar contracts were renewed year after year, always with minimal or no wages and restrictions on movement. Census records from 1870 through 1900 continued to list Sarah domestic servant living in the Whitmore household. No surname was ever recorded. Emancipation had altered her legal status yet erased her identity further. During slavery she had at least been called Sarah Whitmore in some documents. After freedom she was simply Sarah. No last name, no legal identity beyond her function as a servant. By 1902 she had served the family for nearly 50 years, 20 years enslaved, 37 under exploitative contracts. Carter wondered whether Sarah had ever truly been free. The photographer's name appeared faintly embossed in the lower right corner: J. Matthews, Photography, Charleston. City directories listed James Matthews with a studio on King Street from 1898 to 1911. Unlike most of his contemporaries, he advertised services to all respectable persons regardless of station, a coded phrase indicating he photographed black clients as well. At the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture, Carter found newspaper complaints from 1903 and 1904. White photographers accused Matthews of elevating Negroes beyond their proper station by photographing black families in the formal manner reserved for whites. One letter claimed he created a false impression of equality that threatens the natural social order. Matthews had used his camera as a tool of resistance, documenting black dignity in an era designed to deny it. His appointment ledgers confirmed he photographed the Whitmore reception on April 15, 1902, and noted multiple exposures requested. In a letter written the following month to a fellow photographer in Boston, he declared, "I continue to document what I see, not merely what my clients wish to be seen. The camera does not lie, though we who operate cameras often do. I prefer honesty, even when it must be hidden in plain sight." Carter was now certain the image was deliberate. She expanded her search for Sarah's story, contacting descendant communities and sharing the photograph. Within a week, Dorothy Washington of Atlanta replied. Her great-grandmother had spoken of Aunt Sarah, who worked her entire life for a white Charleston family, bore terrible scars on her face, and was never truly free even after the war. According to family oral history, Sarah's full name was Sarah Porter. Born enslaved around 1845 on one of the Whitmore rice plantations. At age 8, she was brought to the Charleston house to serve Mrs. Whitmore and care for the children. She was beaten regularly. Once, trying to protect a younger child from punishment, she was whipped so severely the scars never healed. She was 11 years old, exactly matching the 1859 ledger entry. After emancipation, Sarah had nowhere to go. Her family had been sold away when she was young. She could neither read nor write. The Whitmores offered her wages that were almost nothing and controlled every aspect of her life. She could not leave the house without permission, could not receive visitors, and worked from before dawn until late at night. Dorothy's great-grandmother said it was not freedom at all. Sarah died in 1903, still working in that house, about 58 years old. Her body simply gave out after decades of brutal labor with barely enough food or rest. The Whitmores did not pay for a proper burial. The black community took up a collection so she could be interred in a cemetery for colored people. Dorothy sent copies of family documents, including a small Bible belonging to her great-grandmother. Inside, in careful handwriting dated 1904, was a note, in memory of Sarah Porter, born into slavery, died still serving the family that enslaved her. She never knew freedom. May God grant her rest. Armed with Sarah's identity, Carter returned to Matthews's papers. His correspondence mentioned a project he called the True History Series. In a 1901 letter, he wrote that he was documenting what Charleston refuses to see, the labor that builds this city's wealth, the servants who make possible the leisure of the elite, the people rendered invisible by their society. He had developed a technique of composite images that included both the celebrated subjects and the unseen workers. Several other photographs in his portfolio showed servants appearing faintly in windows, doorways, or reflections while the main subjects remained unaware. Sarah's image was different, placed in the mirror so that once noticed it could not be ignored, yet subtle enough that the Whitmore family never realized she was there. Matthews's journal entries from April 1902 were decisive. On the 14th he wrote, "Tomorrow I photograph the Whitmore reception. I have watched Sarah work, an elderly woman who moves through the rooms like a ghost, unseen by the family she serves. She has worked for them nearly 50 years, first as a slave, now as a servant, who earns barely enough to survive. The whites will celebrate their prosperity tomorrow, never acknowledging that it was built on her labor and the labor of hundreds like her." On the 16th he recorded, "I have completed the Whitmore photograph. I used a technique I have been perfecting, a brief secondary exposure during which I asked Sarah to stand before the mirror while the family remains still. The result is perfect. Sarah appears in the reflection where Mr. Whitmore stands in the main image. She is finally visible, finally documented, finally part of the history that has tried so hard to erase her. The family will never notice, but perhaps someday someone will." Carter systematically examined every photograph in the Matthews collection and identified at least 15 others employing similar techniques. In one Christmas scene, a young black man appeared faintly in a window reflection carrying firewood. In a garden party image, an elderly black woman stood exhausted near the kitchen entrance. Each told the same story, white prosperity made possible by black labor, deliberately recorded by Matthews even as his clients tried to exclude it. He kept a leather notebook labeled Subjects of True History with names, ages, and brief biographical notes on dozens of workers. Sarah's entry read, Sarah Porter, approximately 57 years old, house servant to Whitmore family since childhood, enslaved until 1865, worked under contract since, bears extensive scarring from whipping received as a child, has spent entire life in service to the family that once owned her, represents countless others who were legally free but economically enslaved. Household account books for 1902 and 1903 revealed the mundane cruelty of Sarah's final year. She still received $2 a month, $24 for the entire year, while the family spent $150 on new parlor furniture, $200 on Mrs. Whitmore's trip to New York, and $75 on their son's birthday celebration. In a November 1902 letter, Mrs. Whitmore complained that Sarah had become quite slow and forgetful, could barely manage the stairs, and had dropped a good plate. She threatened to dismiss her, knowing Sarah had nowhere to go. Really, the ingratitude of these people is astonishing, after all we have done for her. In January and March 1903, letters noted that Sarah was unwell and had fainted while carrying laundry, yet was still expected to complete her tasks. The final reference, May 1903, was brief. Our servant Sarah passed away yesterday quite suddenly. She simply collapsed in the kitchen and never regained consciousness. The doctor said her heart gave out. We have hired a new girl who is younger and much more energetic. Sarah's death certificate listed cause of death as heart failure, age approximately 58, name Sarah, surname unknown, burial location Morris Street Colored Cemetery. Even in death, official records denied her a full identity. Carter visited the small, neglected cemetery and, with the help of records, found the simple stone marked only Sarah D. 1903. No surname, no birth year, no epitaph. Standing there, she realized the 1902 photograph was now the most complete record of Sarah's existence, the clearest evidence that she had lived, worked, suffered, and endured for nearly 6 decades while remaining invisible to those she served. Carter published a preliminary article in the Journal of Southern History. The story was picked up by news outlets and resonated widely. Civil rights attorney Michael Robertson contacted her. He specialized in historical land and labor claims and saw legal significance in the contracts: wages of $2 a month, restrictions on movement, inability to leave employment, characteristics of what scholars call neo-slavery or debt peonage. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, yet these arrangements found ways around the prohibition. Together, they examined financial records and calculated that between 1865 and 1903, Sarah had been paid roughly $912 for 30 to 8 years of full-time labor. A minimal fair wage of $15 a month would have totaled over $6,800. The Whitmores had effectively stolen nearly $6,000 from her alone. The pattern extended to many other workers and amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid or underpaid labor. Through genealogical research and outreach, they identified more than 30 living descendants of people enslaved by or employed under the Whitmore family between 1840 and 1920. Family stories aligned with the documents: ancestors trapped by debt, lifelong service for poverty wages, deaths in poverty after decades of labor. Dorothy Washington, Sarah's great-great-niece, organized a gathering in Charleston in March 2020. Descendants shared oral histories. Elijah Thompson spoke of his great-grandfather Marcus, born and died on a Whitmore rice plantation, kept in debt by charges for seeds, tools, and the shack he lived in, free in name only. Patricia Morris told of her great-grandmother Ruth, who cooked every meal for the Whitmores for 35 years at $3 a month and died penniless in a charity home. The group decided to create a memorial and push for historical markers. In October 2020, the Charleston Historical Society opened the permanent exhibition Hidden in Plain Sight: The True Cost of Charleston's Prosperity. Matthews's 1902 photograph, enlarged and fully explained, was the centerpiece, accompanied by other composite images and the stories of dozens of black workers. The exhibit drew thousands of visitors and sparked community conversations about memory, reparations, and present-day inequality. On the anniversary of Sarah's death, May 19, 2021, a new marker was dedicated beside her simple stone. Sarah Porter, born into slavery circa 1845, died 1903. She spent 58 years serving the Whitmore family, first as enslaved property, then as an exploited worker. Her labor and the labor of countless others like her built Charleston's prosperity. She deserved freedom, dignity, and fair compensation. She received none of these. We remember her now. We honor her labor. We acknowledge the injustice she endured. Dorothy Washington spoke. Sarah never got to tell her own story. She couldn't read or write. She had no power, no voice. But she was seen by James Matthews, who documented her presence when everyone else tried to keep her invisible. Now, more than a century later, we are finally listening. The wealth built on their unpaid labor still exists. The families that exploited them are still prosperous. The descendants of the exploited still live with the economic consequences. Truth and acknowledgement are only the beginning, but they are necessary. Dr. Carter added that history is not solely the record of great events and famous people. It is also the ordinary people whose labor made society possible and whose stories were deliberately excluded. Matthews used his camera to reveal what the powerful wanted hidden. The photograph had finally made Sarah Porter visible, not as invisible property or a nameless servant, but as a human being whose life mattered, whose labor deserved recognition, and whose story demanded to be told. The reflection in the mirror had revealed more than one woman's suffering. It had exposed a systematic exploitation that continued long after legal emancipation. Truth, even when deliberately obscured, can survive in archives, photographs, and family memory, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to see what has always been there.